Committee will come to order. After having explored the next steps of defense reform in yesterday's hearing, we now turn to what is needed to repair and rebuild our military. And I'm grateful to each of the distinguished service chiefs for being with us today. There's widespread agreement that funding cuts under the Budget Control Act, plus a series of continuing resolutions coupled with a pace of required deployments, have damaged the U.S. military. I believe that damage has gone far deeper than most of us realize, requiring more time and more money to repair than is generally expected. There's plenty of responsibility to go around for the current state of affairs with both Congress and the Obama administration, with both Republicans and Democrats, with both military and civilian leadership. Among other problems, defense funding has gotten caught up in partisan back and forth on other issues and has even been held hostage to other priorities. We need to get back to evaluating defense needs on their own without regard to any agreement or disagreement we may have on other issues. The men and women who serve deserve at least that. The most important thing now is to repair the damage. We have the chance to begin doing so by passing a full appropriation bill for this year, acting favorably upon the supplemental request, and then enacting adequate authorization and appropriations for fiscal year 2018. The immediate issue before us is the expiration of the current continuing resolution on April 28th. We in the House passed a full appropriation bill for FY17 on March 8th by a vote of 371 to 48. The Senate has not yet acted on it. As I've said before, I will not vote for a defense continuing resolution for the rest of fiscal year 17. It would simply do too much harm. Fundamental to fixing a problem is to expose it and understand it. I understand that we have to be cautious about exposing our vulnerabilities. But in order to do better for the military and for the country, we must have the best professional military judgment our witnesses today can offer on the current state of our military forces and on what a CR or inadequate funding would mean for them. To get on a better track, we all have to be clear and candid with the American people. And that's exactly the purpose of today's hearing. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with much of what the Chairman had to say. I mean, certainly over the course of the last 6+ years, the uncertainty that has accompanied the defense budget has made it very, very difficult to operate. We've had one government shutdown, countless threatened government shutdowns, and numerous CRs. And I think most people don't appreciate what a CR means. It's like, well, you're just continuing the budget. A CR basically means you can't start new programs, you can't end programs that need to be ended, and as importantly, a lot of times you're not really sure what qualifies as which. All of you have to go through a very difficult task when we don't have a regular appropriations bill of figuring out exactly what you can and cannot spend money on. And that is a colossal waste of your time and also very expensive. We should give you a clear budget every year, clear appropriations to give you the freedom to implement that as is necessary. We have not done that, and I agree with the Chairman. There's plenty of blame to go around on that front. But the lack of budget clarity has caused no end of problems. I also agree that the force has unquestionably been stressed over the course of the last 15 years, certainly with two major wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the ongoing struggle against extremism all across the world. Our military has been given a large number of assignments, and couple that with the inadequate, with the unpredictable number of resources, and you have a problem. I think there's a larger thing that we need to get at, and I agree with the Chairman, again, that we need an appropriations bill and we need to fund the military to meet the mission. I don't agree that we can somehow pull defense out of the entire rest of the federal government, look at it totally separately as if all the other money that we spend in the government doesn't matter. Because unfortunately, we do have other priorities than just national security, some of which are really rather important. In fact, some of them have to do with security, the intelligence budget, the Department of Homeland Security, but also our infrastructure, which is crumbling at an alarming rate. And it regrettably is a trade-off. And I think the budget that President Trump sent up this year makes that absolutely clear. He plussed up defense by $54 billion, and he took that $54 billion out of everything else, including a 31% cut in the State Department. And as the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, said, if you're going to cut the State Department and if you're going to cut development aid, then you better give me 5 more divisions because I'm going to have a lot of wars to fight. It is all of a piece. As much as I would love on this committee to be able to just pull defense out and say we can ignore everything else, we aren't just members of the Defense Committee, we are members of Congress, and we're responsible for all of that. Towards that end, I'll make one final point. As we look at how we put together a defense budget, I agree with the chairman. We should not give the men and women who serve in the military tasks and assignments that we do not equip and train them to do. That is where we are at right now. That is completely and totally unacceptable. I do not, however, agree that the answer is to simply continue to expand what those tasks and responsibilities should be and kind of hope that we somehow come up with more money to meet it, because the tasks and responsibilities that have been described by the President and what he says he wants the military to do, he sent up a $603 billion budget. That doesn't even come close to meeting those tasks and responsibilities that are outlined. Even the $640 billion that the chairman here and the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee have talked about doesn't come close to meeting that either. So what we also need to do, in addition to rightly pointing out the lack of resources and the unpredictability, is come up with a set of tasks and missions for the Department of Defense, for the men and women who serve in the armed services, that we can actually fund. We cannot continue to say, well, you got to do this, you got to do this, we don't have the money, we don't have the money, we should have the money, we don't have the money, we should have the money. We know where our budget is at. We know that we're $20 trillion in debt, that we're running a deficit in excess of $600 billion, and that there are other needs in our budget. So I think we also have to be really smart about how we spend the money in defense and about what missions we decide our men and women should be ready, trained, and equipped to serve. So I hope that's part of the discussion as well this morning. I look forward to your testimony, and I thank you all for your service.
We're pleased to welcome this morning the General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army, Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, General David Goldfein, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and General Robert Neller, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record. And let me just say again how much I appreciate each of you being here. I know you have a lot of responsibilities on your shoulders. I know, for example, the Commandant came back a day early from an overseas trip, but I believe the opportunity to get funding for the military on a better track deserves all of our careful attention and discussion. Again, that's the purpose of today's hearing. Thank you all for being here. General Milley would be pleased to turn to you for any oral statement you'd like to make.
Thanks, Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith and all the distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity before you today. I appreciate that, and I know we all do. The world is becoming a more dangerous place with simultaneous challenges to the United States interests from Russia, China, Iran, a rapidly growing threat from North Korea, and an ongoing series of wars against terrorists. This is no time, in my professional view, to increase risk to our national security. A year-long CR or a return to the BCA funding will do just that. It will increase risk to the nation and will ultimately result in dead Americans on a future battlefield. To execute current operations, sustain readiness while making progress toward a more capable and lethal future, the United States Army requires, most importantly, predictable and consistent funding. The lack of fiscal year 2017 appropriations and no supplemental increase in funding will significantly and negatively impact readiness and increase risk to our force. Additionally, a return to budget caps due to BCA sequestration in fiscal year 18 forces the Army to reverse our efforts to improve readiness and will lead to a hollow Army. In the last 2 years, we have made steady progress in our core warfighting skills across multiple types of units, but we have much work to do to achieve full-spectrum readiness necessary to meet the demands of our national military strategy and the defense planning guidance. Advances by our adversaries are real, and the cumulative effect of persistent and destructive budget instability for 8 consecutive years is increasing risk, not only to the Army, but to the nation, and will result in unnecessary U.S. casualties. Readiness to prevent, or if necessary, fight and win wars is a very, very expensive proposition. But the cost of preparation is always far less than the cost, the pain, the blood, and the sacrifice of regret. Readiness is the Army's #1 priority. Our current readiness funding requirement is submitted in the amendment to the FY17 President's budget is $3 billion above fiscal year 2016's operations and maintenance levels. Our planning efforts for FY17 requests for additional appropriations centered on filling critical gaps in readiness, specifically in armor, air defense, field artillery, and aviation. If forced to operate under a year-long CR, this will not happen, and Army current readiness and efforts to close critical gaps will be severely impacted. Funding under a CR for a year will result in a dramatic decrease in training starting next month in May. And by 15 July, all Army training will cease, except those units deploying to Afghanistan or Iraq. Our CTC, collective training exercises at NTC, JRTC, will be significantly degraded, and all efforts to increase Army end strength as mandated in the FY17 National Defense Authorization Act by you for the regular Army, the National Guard, and the Army Reserve will also cease. The cumulative effect of training shortfalls combined with personnel constraints will result in an Army that is less ready to meet not only current requirements of combatant commanders, but limit our ability to assure our allies, deter our adversaries now and in the future. Also, procurement efforts currently on hold will remain on hold, preventing the Army from immediately addressing known shortfalls and gaps in combat systems and, importantly, in munitions, electronic warfare, cyber programs, air and missile defense, long-range fires, protection, and mobility programs, along with several other modernization initiatives. We will lose our current overmatch. The current battlefield is already very lethal, and a future battlefield will likely prove far more lethal than anything we have recently experienced. Our adversaries have studied us and are rapidly leveraging available technology, while the Army has yet to fully recover from the effects of the shutdown in 2013. Time is not our ally. A return to the BCA caps will damage the Army's ability to build and maintain readiness at appropriate levels and result in multiple years of negative impacts on the future of our Army. While we cannot forecast precisely when and where the next contingency will arise, it is very likely to require a significant commitment of U.S. Army ground forces. Sustaining the high levels of performance that your Army has demonstrated in the face of increasing challenges requires consistent, long-term, balanced, and predictable funding. A year-long continuing resolution or a return to BCA funding caps absolutely will result in a U.S. Army that is outranged, outgunned, and outdated against potential adversaries. With your support, however, in passing the FY17 budget and the supplemental, the Army will fund readiness at sufficient levels to meet current demand, build readiness for contingencies, and invest in the future force. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Admiral Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss the impacts that another continuing resolution, in fact, just to leverage General Milley's statement, continuing uncertain and inadequate funding levels would do to the Navy. And 2 points I just want to clarify and clearly convey right off the top is that, Mr. Chairman, we need that FY17 bill and the supplemental in order to keep Navy programs and key investments moving forward, to recover readiness this year, prevent digging the readiness hole deeper, and to sustain it into the near future. There's a growing gap between the missions that we are asking our Navy to do and the unreliability and shortage of the resources provided to do those missions, as Ranking Member Smith highlighted. We got to where we are today because of 15 years of operating at wartime pace. The Eisenhower Strike Group has deployed 5 times in the last 7 years. Contrast that level of effort with 8 years of continuing resolutions and 5 years of budget restrictions imposed by the Budget Control Act and the Balanced Budget Acts. This gap creates years of stress over and above the inherent stress of deployed operations. And the Navy team, in fact, the Joint Service Team, the Joint Force Team, sailors, civilians, and their families have been absorbing that stress. And so in the simplest possible terms, as I speak to you today, if we don't get the funding just described, lots of our aviators will not fly, and they can't train. We won't have the spares to fix their planes. We won't have the gas to fly them. We may not have the pay to keep our pilots in the services, and we won't have ready aircraft for tomorrow's pilots. Lots of sailors will not go to sea. We can't afford the maintenance to fix their ships. We can't afford the gas to steam them. The ships will remain tied up to the pier. In many ways, this is irreversible. You can't get lost training time back. We will be less proficient when we do go to sea, when we do fly. Our pilots will be less experienced, which is a daunting fact when you consider what we're asking them in wartime. Our sailors will have less time at sea to practice together, to train together, to achieve the intricate teamwork needed to win in modern warfare. And the stress doesn't stop when they return to home port. The current funding, without the 17 bill and the supplemental, will only allow for 1 month's notice before they move their families, placing a huge burden on their families, and especially those with children. And we'll continue to ask our people to work in substandard conditions in over 6,000 buildings, in dismal condition, awaiting repair, replacement, or demolition. At the unit level, we'll have to shut down air wings in the short term, and in the long term, the shortage of airplanes will get worse. We'll delay important upgrades that help us keep pace with the threat. These delays or cancellations will put sailors at greater risk from cyber attacks or the growing threat of anti-ship missiles in the areas that they routinely operate. Submarines will lose their certification to dive. Ships will be at the pier instead of underway. Failing to maintain our equipment has the same net effect as cutting force structure. Whether we leave a ship tied up to the pier because it's not repaired, or we decide not to build a new ship, both mean one less ship at sea. Not being able to fly an existing aircraft or not buying a new aircraft, both mean one less plane in the air. And as the General said, this is not a theoretical debate. While we talk about whether or not to keep ships in port and aircraft on the ground, our competitors are making steady progress and gaining on us. America's risks are getting worse as other nations grow their fleet and operate them in the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic Oceans, as they extend their influence over trade routes that are the lifeblood of the international economy, including ours. I just got back from Rota, Spain, where I saw our sailors in action. We visited the USS Ross, who is now in the increasingly contested waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. Those sailors know clearly that they are sailing into harm's way. But they took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and they live up to that commitment every day, undaunted by the competition I just described. And their teammates do this every day all around the world. They are tough, dedicated, proud of what they do. Back here at home, there's less evidence that we get it. There is tangible lack of urgency. We're not doing what we should to help them win. In fact, we are here today to discuss plans, potential plans, that would make their lives harder, that will further shrink their advantage. Mr. Chairman, I urge Congress to pass the FY17 bill and give favorable consideration to the supplemental. It will make us more ready, more competitive, and relieve a lot of stress that is on our people. Together, we can find ways to maintain our edge. There is so much at stake. Thank you for the chance to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
General Goldfein.
Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee for hosting this critically important and timely hearing. It's a privilege to be here with my fellow Joint Chiefs. Your Air Force is globally engaged, both here in the homeland and deployed, to capture and control the high ground as we provide global vigilance, global reach, and global power for America and our allies. As the service with the most diverse portfolio of missions, operating from the outer reaches of space to 100 feet below the surface and everywhere in between, we are involved in some way in every mission the Joint Force performs. Put simply, your Air Force is always there. Our responsibility begins in the nuclear enterprise as we ensure the bomber and missile legs of the triad remain safe, secure, and reliable. And on our worst day as a nation, we ensure the Commander-in-Chief is where he needs to be, when he needs to be there, and that he remains connected to our Air Force and Naval nuclear forces who stand watch for America and our allies. In space, your airmen fly and maintain 12 constellations that provide critical intelligence, protected communications, nuclear command and control, and GPS for the joint team and for the globe. When China launched its anti-satellite missile in 2007, creating a debris field over 300,000 particles, space became both a contested and a congested place. And it's the responsibility of your Air Force to organize, train, equip, and present the preponderance of ready space forces to combatant commanders to fight should a war either start or extend into space. In the cyber domain, airmen join their fellow soldiers, sailors, and Marines to defend the nation and develop tactics, techniques, and procedures to produce strategic effects in this new and critical warfighting domain. Just 16 years ago, we had a single remotely piloted aircraft in test. Today, your Air Force delivers 60 lines of armed reconnaissance, along with high-altitude capabilities that provide an unblinking eye on our adversaries. If you heard jet noise this morning driving to the Capitol, it was likely the F-16s from the 113th Air National Guard Wing at Andrews, who sit strip alert to defend this city, just as we do across the nation to defend our homeland from attack. And I learned just walking in this morning that we lost an F-16 from that wing this morning. And I'm proud to say that at least the news reports are telling us the pilot got out and he's okay. These are just some of the missions we perform here. Simultaneously, airmen are operating forward in over 175 locations to assure allies and partners, deter adversaries, shape the environment, and respond to crises. Job one for our deployed forces is to gain and maintain air superiority, which we define as freedom from attack and freedom to maneuver. When a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, or Coast Guardsman hears jet noise, I don't ever want them to look up. I want them to know it's me. This is sacred duty for an airman. Once we establish air superiority, your Air Force provides unmatched global reach, with an aircraft taking off or landing every 3 minutes, delivering critical personnel or supplies where and when they're needed. And we sometimes operate out of locations that are in insecure areas. And it's our special forces, air commandos, who are trained to secure airfields when and where we need them, in places like Kiara West in Iraq. And when it comes to global precision strike, I call your attention to the January raid, where a pair of B-2 bombers departed their home base in Missouri for a 32-hour round-trip sortie to Libya. These stealth bomber crews, refueled by 13 different tankers, delivered 85 bombs over 2 terrorist camps, delivering precise lethal effects within 10 seconds. And I repeat, 32-hour mission within 10 seconds of their designated time over target.
And in the counter-ISIS fight, Lieutenant General Jeff Harigian, the Air Component Commander, leads a coalition of 16 nations in the fight to defeat violent extremism in the Middle East. In the current fight against ISIS, coalition partners have dropped over 40,000 munitions on our enemy, with the vast majority coming from the United States Air Force. For our enemy, always there has a different meaning. General Hap Arnold, who led the air effort during World War II, stated during the worst days of the daylight bombing campaign, "The problem with air power is we make it look too easy." The truth is anything but. Today's Air Force is the smallest, oldest, and least ready in its history. We have and will continue to fly, fight, and win, but at a cost to our airmen and their families who remain globally engaged. Chairman, it's fitting that we're having this hearing on Gold Star Spouse Day as a reminder of how vital our families are to our mission. For 26 years of continuous conflict, starting with Operation Desert Storm, through Operations Northern and Southern Watch, Deliberate and Allied Force in the Balkans, Odyssey Dawn in Libya, and the current fights in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, they have remained faithful to our cause. So it's unfortunate that we are now discussing the potential of yet another extended continuing resolution, which, as has already been said, is the equivalent of a mini sequestration round, which we have already been through before. You see, in the Air Force, we still haven't recovered from round one. Failing to pass an appropriations bill will cost the Air Force $2.8 billion in the remaining 5 months of 2017. Here are just two of the direct impacts to our most important resource, our airmen and their families, of failing to pass a budget. We'll stop flying in late June when the money runs out, so only squadrons in the fight or preparing to go to the fight will train. By the end of this year, we will be short 1,000 fighter pilots. Chairman, it takes approximately 10 years and $10 million to train a fighter pilot. 1,000 short equates to $10 billion of capital investment that walked out the door. And it will take us 10 years to replace that experience. Of all the things that we can do to retain pilots, the most important is to get them airborne. Pilots who don't fly, maintainers who don't maintain, air traffic controllers that don't control, leave. And while we'll never buy our way out of this shortage, an extended CR will also negate the pilot bonuses Congress authorized, which will break faith with the force. In addition, over 2,000 young men and women have signed up to serve in the long blue line who will not be allowed to enter the service until we get an appropriation. They represent the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal. They come from each of your districts. They have given up jobs, left home, made plans, all to be told they will have to wait now for months to pursue their dream. How many of these talented young men and women won't wait and will choose an alternative path when we desperately need to grow our force in FY17? As a service chief, I have many obligations, but one remains paramount. Every airman we send into harm's way must be properly organized, trained, and equipped and led to succeed in their mission. And we must take care of their families while they're gone. This is our moral obligation. A year-long CR makes meeting this obligation extremely difficult. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of this committee, the demand for air and space superiority has never been higher. With it, we win. Without it, we lose. We look forward to working with you in the weeks ahead to pass a budget, and thank you again for holding this critically important hearing, and look forward to your questions.
General Neller.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, I'll be brief so we can get to your questions. First, let me fully endorse the comments of my fellow chiefs. And second, I think it's important to remember that the readiness of our respective services are inextricably linked. The fleet doesn't sail, Marines don't get to sea. The Army can't train, we can't train with them. The Air Force can't fly, we can't move around the world. So none of us can do anything by ourselves. So our readiness of our respective forces are part of that of the joint force. Marines have a unique perspective on readiness based on the direction of the Congress as the nation's force in readiness. Being ready is central to our identity. So the bottom line is this: operating under a full-year continuing resolution through the remainder of this FY will seriously degrade readiness across the force and have adverse effects on future readiness. Specifically, we will cease CONUS-based flight operations in late July or early August, with the exception of those squadrons getting ready to deploy. Lack of funding will slow, halt, or potentially reverse hard-earned material readiness recovery efforts across the force. It will slow the acquisition of critical systems and delay the construction of much-needed amphibious warships. The scope and scale of our training will be significantly reduced, impacting service-level pre-deployment training such as the integrated training exercise at 29 Palms, which is our key event for certification before deployment. Other events, large multilateral and multinational exercises such as Bold Alligator at Camp Lejeune or our cold weather training in Norway, Cold Response, will also be degraded. And we'll be challenged to recover from these training gaps, because once you lose a training, you can't get it back. You can't get it back because there's another unit in the queue ready to go, and if you miss it, you're not going to get another turn. As Representative Smith mentioned, the global security environment drives the requirements which determine our operational commitments. Your Marines are as busy now as they were during the height of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just this morning, I returned from visiting Marines and our joint and coalition partners forward deployed in the Republic of Korea and Japan. I assure you that the forward deployed force is engaged around the globe in support of not only PACOM but all combatant commanders and is ready to go. Our current operational tempo, combined against fiscal reductions, the instability of these CRs, and the lasting impacts of sequestration, continue to make us make hard choices that prioritize support to the operational forces above many other resource requirements. The priority has and will continue to go to deployed and the next to deploy units. But that results in readiness shortfalls in aviation, facilities, sustainment, modernization, retention of critical skills, and the depth and readiness of our ready bench. Working with our Congress and our chiefs and the Department of Defense and the Chairman and the Secretary, I assure you the Marine Corps will make the most of those resources we are provided, and that Marines will meet the high standards of the Congress and the American people regardless. I look forward to your questions.
Let me ask each of you to address a relatively simple question. Why is it different now? As Admiral Richardson and Mr. Smith mentioned, we've had 8 years of CRs, 5 years of the Budget Control Act. You know, to most people, they look and say, well, we're still bombing ISIS, you know, we're getting by, we're doing what needs to be done, and yet each of you has painted a pretty dire picture of where we are and especially where we would be under a CR or without a supplemental. So again, I guess my basic question is, why is it different now? General Milley?
In my view, it's the cumulative effect. We've been doing CRs now for 8 years, shut down in 13. It's the cumulative effect on personnel. We've reduced the Army by 80 or 90,000 soldiers in the last 8 years. We've taken out 17 brigade combat teams. We're still have 180,000 soldiers today deployed in 140 countries around the world. We're still actively engaged in terms of op-tempo and combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Central Africa, West Africa, and several other places. Roughly speaking, I just got back from the Middle East last week. 80% of those forces that you see on the ground in those countries are Army forces. It's the cumulative effect of all of these years. And oh, by the way, it's not just fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are other potential contingencies on the horizon. We saw that yesterday morning, the launching of a nuclear missile, or not a nuclear missile, but a missile from North Korea that landed in the Sea of Japan. I have no idea, neither does anybody in this room, where all that leads. We must be ready. It's the cumulative effect. Chairman, if I was to draw an analogy, it'd be like smoking cigarettes. One cigarette's not going to kill you, but you do that for 8, 10, 20 years, 30 years, you're eventually going to die of lung cancer. It's the cumulative effect over time that is really devastating, and the seesaw effect of money in and money out. And also, we can't invest in modernization because industry has to have predictable funding, and we can't do that. It's a not only is it negative on immediate readiness, it's devastating on future modernization because we can't get out in front of it, and it's much more expensive when you can't do multi-year contracts. It's very expensive. It's inefficient, ineffective way of doing the budget.
Admiral?
Mr. Chairman, I would pile on top of everything that General Milley said. It is the cumulative effect of this triple whammy of the operational pace against fighting violent extremism, contrasted against the uncertainty of the budget and the budgetary levels. And we always, all of us, strive to send our forces forward fully ready into those fights so that they're fully prepared for any contingency that comes their way. But that has come at the cost of readiness back home and those reinforcement forces, those surge forces that would flow into the fight if we had a major contingency, as the General highlighted. I would also say that one thing in my mind that has characterized the discussion is that it's very internally focused, and it is not just us that's been operating in the world in the last 10 years. So if we had this conversation 8 years ago, in the intervening 8 years, China has completely modernized their fleet, and they are operating not just around their shores, but around the world now. Russia was actually considered an ally at that time. We were exercising with Russia, and now it's a much different picture. The General mentioned North Korea and Iran. These competitors have also grown in these last intervening 8 years, and so the relative balance has shifted. So it's a combination of our internal effects, the stress of 10 years of combat operations, 15 years, contrasted against the funding instability and levels, but it is also our competitors that have been making significant gains during those 8 years.
General Goldfein?
Sir, that's really, let me build on Admiral Richardson's comments, because the reality is the world changed in 2014. If you go back to prior to 2014 and look at our posture and the collective assumptions we were making both within Congress and the executive branch, we were out of Iraq, we were coming down in Afghanistan, and in a single year, the world changed for us. Russia went into Crimea and got active in Ukraine. China started militarizing islands in the South China Sea. We had ISIS, and we went back into Iraq. And you may remember that we had this thing called Ebola that happened during 2014. And while we may now all look back on that as not that big a deal as we were going through it, you might recall that we weren't sure whether we were facing the plague of the 21st century. All that happened in a single year. So the world changed. And so the assumptions that we had made in terms of strategic trades that we make, because as service chiefs, what we do is we look at try to balancing capability, capacity, and readiness. And we make strategic trades based on our assumptions of the global security environment. And so to your question of what's different now, the world's different now.
Thank you. Commandant?
Chairman, on 9/11, there were 172,500 Marines, and we deployed at a rate of 3 to 1. We were home for 18 months, and we were gone for 6. And the gear we had was the gear we had from the 1980s buildup. It was only 16, 15, 12 years old. You go to Camp Lejeune, Camp Pendleton today, you drive around, that's the same stuff we're driving today. It's been modified, been re-engineered. It's been through the depot. Still flying the same F-18s. We got one squadron F-35s. We replaced CH-46s with MB-22s. We're flying the same 53s. We're starting to get at replacing the Hueys and Cobras. The force now deploys at a rate of 2 to 1. I mean, we have to recapitalize this force. We fought a fight against an insurgent in a counterinsurgency stability op. And as my fellow chief said, the game has changed. We weren't talking about 4+1 even 5, 6 years ago. And all their stuff is new. And we need to have our stuff modernized, and we have to change our training. And we can do all that. We can do all that. And we're in the process of doing that. But we need to have the stability of a known funding stream so that we can get the best price for modern gear, that we can plan our training, that we know we're going to go, and we know we're going to get a ride either on an airplane or a ship. And our allies know they're going to be able to show up, and we're going to be there to train with them. And this potentially puts all that at risk.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I should have no questions. I have the opportunity to speak to these gentlemen a number of occasions, so I will let Ms. Davis take the first questions for our side.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for your service and for being here today. You know, you make a very good case, and I think we are all with you in understanding the difficulties, the challenges that you face. But I'm also wondering, you know, here we are, it's April, we haven't passed last year's budget yet. In many ways, as you say, we're dealing with a continuing CR, which in many ways is almost the norm. And so what is it that we should be looking at doing? Are there different metrics when it comes to readiness and setting priorities that suggest that we actually have to adapt to this kind of situation and still accomplish the mission? What do you think needs to be done differently at all if this is the new normal?
I don't accept it.
I'm not suggesting that I like the new normal.
I don't accept it as a new normal, Congresswoman. I think, candidly, failure to pass a budget, in my view, as both an American citizen and the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, constitutes professional malpractice. I don't think we should accept it as the new normal. I think we should pass it and pass the supplemental with it and get on with it. The world is a dangerous place, and it's becoming more dangerous by the day. Pass the budget.
Ma'am, here's what this new normal would mean. It would mean trying to run a mile race and giving the competition a lap head start. You got to run very fast if you're going to win that race, and we're just not fast. So that's what you buy into if you accept this as a new normal. I couldn't agree with the chief more.
Ma'am, I'll just use this as an opportunity to remind us in terms of what I think you expect from us as Joint Chiefs. And that is, I think you need from us our best military advice on what we think we need to be able to perform the missions that we're being given. And until those missions change, what we will continue to tell you is what the force requires. So the resistance you're getting from us relative to setting some kind of a new normal is that the missions haven't changed. And so what you won't hear from us is anything but, here's what is required to do those missions which we have been given to defend this nation and to do those missions that are required both here in the homeland and abroad.
I think we have adapted. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do the things that we do every day. That doesn't mean we like it. I mean, we're not perfect. We make mistakes, but I think we're adaptable because of the men and women that serve in our services are really smart and they're mission-oriented and they figure out a way to get it done. And everybody's, you know, hedging or whatever they're doing. But the bill is in the back end. And the people we're contesting right now, they don't have armored forces. They don't have electronic warfare. They don't have an air force. They don't have long-range artillery. They don't have the ability to jam space and deny our networks. That's who's out there potentially in the wings. And that's what we're trying to get at. And you know, the force, we're a volunteer force, or more accurately, we're an all-recruited force. And it's expensive. And that's, in order to continue to recruit, you have to have the capability that they think they can have the opportunity to be successful against these other threats. And we can assume that it may or may not happen, that's not my job. My job is to manage risk and provide best military advice. So we need stability. We need to be able to plan. We need to know whatever the number is, and then we'll go forward. But the force has to have confidence that they're going to have a continued resource stream for the capabilities they need to train and to be operational, and for their families, and for all those things that you have to have with an all-volunteer force.
Thank you. Right now, we actually have a hiring freeze, a federal hiring freeze. And is that contributing to degraded readiness?
I would say, I'll just go
And in what way?
the other way, but we've had pretty good luck on, because of the parameters and the guidance that was given as far as we could get a waiver for those jobs on the civilian side that were directly affecting readiness, maintainers, people that are involved in certain things. It's not perfect, and it has caused some problems, particularly on the non-appropriated side. And sadly, the people that were mostly hurt by that were a lot of family members who worked in those organizations where we couldn't get a waiver. But we've worked through it, and we've got good reaction from Secretary Stackley and Secretary Mattis in the department to fill those jobs. But it was just another thing, because as you know, ma'am, it takes time to fill those jobs, particularly if they involve a security clearance.
Mm-hmm.
If the others of you have comments, if you'd submit them in writing too. We'll try to keep to as close as we can to the 5-minute rule because of the number of members. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, for your coordinating this important hearing today on urgent issues to American families. I appreciate each of you for your extraordinary dedicated service to our nation. I would prefer that we were under better circumstances, but unfortunately budget uncertainty is an issue that needs to be understood by the American people. Your clarity today is very much appreciated. In South Carolina, I represent over 48,000 enlisted soldiers who annually graduate and are stationed at Fort Jackson, along with the nearby base at Fort Gordon and the nearby airmen at Shaw Air Force Base, the Marines at Parris Island, Beaufort Naval Hospital, Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station, and the Guard members at McEntire Joint Air Base. South Carolina knows and loves our military. Your leadership provides young people opportunities for meaningful and fulfilling lives while protecting American families. Additionally, as a veteran, son of a veteran, I'm grateful I have 4 sons that have served overseas in the military, along with a nephew in the Air Force who has served in Iraq. It is for this reason that I'm particularly concerned about the negative impacts a continuing resolution would have on military families, such as deferred reenlistment bonuses, delayed family moves from summer to the school year, reprogrammed military equipment upgrades with limited training. How would each of you describe the real-life consequences to military families that impact that continuing resolution poses on our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines? How would this affect service member morale, recruitment, and retention? And additionally, could each of you provide one specific impact that stands apart from the rest? General Milley.
Thanks, Congressman, and I appreciate the comment. And in South Carolina, as you mentioned, you got Fort Jackson. At Fort Jackson alone, on an annual basis, we train, we recruit, and bring into basic combat training the equivalent of the British Army every year. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, or Fort Hood, Texas, if you combine both those bases, that's equivalent of the Australian and Canadian armies put together. What will happen in your state, in South Carolina, and many other states that have basic training, Missouri and Georgia and elsewhere, that basic training is going to stop in July. We're going to run out of money next month, and then over the following 60 days, we're going to not have the gasoline, the fuel, the ammunition, et cetera. And basic training is going to stop. And what that will mean is we can't take those basic trainings that are already there and then onward deploy them or PCS them to operational units. And we'll have to keep them right there at the fort. They won't be doing anything. They won't be training. They won't be doing anything of substantive value. And then we won't be able to recruit and bring in more trainings. So if we don't get this budget passed, we don't get the supplemental pass, Fort Jackson and many other forts, for all intents and purposes, will be coming to a screeching halt for all of the activities and training that goes on them. the impact on families will be significant. We're already cut back on several services throughout the Army, and we will continue to have to cut back on more services for families, family members. You're going to have to stop PCS moves. You're going to have to cancel bonuses. And bottom line is you're going to significantly and radically increase stress on the force that Admiral Richardson talked about. That's going to be throughout all the services. It'll be very dramatic. It'll be very significant. And it's something that should and must be avoided, in my view.
Admiral.
Sir, before I begin, I also have to thank you for hosting our nuclear power school down there in South Carolina.
Well, that's a bit out of the region, so I was just trying to include ones nearby.
Okay, all right. Well, it's not too far.
No, and see, I would have included Charleston Air Force Base too, but I was trying just to stay within the immediate region.
Roger, sir. Well, I only highlight that because it is some of these areas that are where are some of our most skilled operators, our nuclear trainers, our combat aviators. You know, those are the folks that will be, you know, they will be the first to leave. This is where we talk about competition. Competition's everywhere I look. Competition is certainly in the security environment around the world, but I'll tell you, I'm competing every day for people. I'm competing with the public sector, and the pool of qualified people to do those skills is small to start with and gets smaller every time somebody gets hired by another place. And when we talk about 1 month notice to move your family and children from Norfolk to Guam in the middle of the school year, that is a huge detractor, and that talent will leave, and I will lose that fight for people. And the highest skilled, smartest, those folks will leave first.
Thank you very much. And the rest, if you could respond in writing, thank you very much.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I want to thank you all for your testimony, but most especially for your service to the nation. So like all of you, I'm very concerned about the impact of a CR across the board, but especially when it comes to something like cyber. So can you discuss the potential impacts upon cyber programs, particularly those that might be a new start this year, such as the persistent training environment? General Milley, I'm going to start with you as PTE is an Army program, but then I'd ask the other services to add their thoughts. Next, for all of our witnesses also, I remain also concerned about recruiting and retaining highly trained cyber warriors, especially as U.S. Cyber Command has provided personnel from each of the services rather than raising their own forces. So the critical role Cybercom plays in defending national interests against cyber attacks and providing support to military operations is an imperative that we obviously cannot afford to lose. And how will a CR and other budget gimmickry hamper your ability to recruit and retain the best of the best?
Thanks, Congressman. As you rightly point out, cyber is a relatively new domain of war, as we refer to it, and it's critically important, and significant damage can be done to adversaries through the use of cyber. And so it's really important that we as a military, and the Army's playing its role, develop both offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. For the most part, for the Army operational units, they focus on protection of the networks and protection of the force's defensive cyber capabilities. The impact of the continuing resolution means that we're not going to be able to finish the facilities at Fort Gordon, which is the Cyber School Center of Excellence. It means that the National Guard is not going to be able to field their cyber protection teams, their defense teams for the National Guard, and we will not be able to continue the level of training that we need to do for the teams that are already formed in the regular Army. In addition to that, the CR will likely have a negative effect on the recruitment of the best talent that we can get out there to become cyber warriors. It's a new branch in the Army. Thus far, we've had great success. We need to continue that momentum. A continued resolution or return to BCA funding is going to stop that momentum right in its tracks.
Thank you, General. Admiral?
Sir, I'll just again pile on. We've been organizing for cyber for some time now, and that organization includes people, the talented people that General Milley referred to. And so we have a requirement for 40 cyber mission teams that constitute a cyber mission force throughout the Joint Force. And then there is the engineering. We need to do the work to engineer our systems to make them more resilient against a cyber attack. Our latest development in that is to stand up the Digital Warfare Office this year on my staff that will work with the fleets to enhance our agility in the information domain across the board. And it's a very comprehensive program. I would love to come and talk to you about it in more detail, but that will stop without this funding. And also, many of those upgrades, those modernizations that I talked about, are to enhance our resilience against cyber attack, which, those, as the chief said, critical vulnerabilities, the first shots in the next war. In fact, the war that's going on right now is in the cyber domain. The war is on there. We need to keep that funding in place.
Thank you, Admiral. General.
So I'll just add that to offer you some thoughts on what this is doing to Admiral Rogers as the combatant commander who is entrusted with the mission of defending the nation in cyber, defending the defense networks, and ensuring that we have the talent to be able to do his mission. All of us contribute to those cyber mission teams, and while we can't go into operational details, this extended CR will have an impact on all of our ability to be able to put those teams in place and allow him to accomplish the mission that he's been given at that very national level.
So I was up at Fort Meade talking to Marines at Mar 4 Cyber, and a sergeant stuck his hand up and he goes, "Hey, Commandant, how are you going to afford to keep me?" I said, "I don't know if I can afford to keep you. What's it going to cost me?" I don't know if there's enough money out there. We got people up there getting offered six figures plus to leave and go work in the civilian side. So we've already we've closed on, we're going to have to treat cyber like special operations. Once you're in, because the investment's too high to get them trained, they got to stay. But then I got to figure out how to pay them or get a contract out of them long enough to get a return. Obviously, if we're at a CR level, any money for bonuses or anything like that, there's a trade-off for something else. You'll find the money, but what are you going to take it away from? There are no good choices.
Thank you all.
Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your very candid and sobering explanation of what we're facing. Been on this committee for a while, and I can remember in years past when witnesses came in and just danced around the edges about what the consequences would be if we didn't do our responsibility the right way. And unfortunately, we're seeing the results of it now. But understanding in clear and uncertain terms of what it means to each of the branches and to the country overall, I think is the sobering information we need. With that in mind, I want to talk about the potential strains on the military and tie in with what you have been saying to highlight what I think our most important resource, our men and women. So we need the weapon systems, we need the modernization, but without the men and women, as you've been saying, we've got a real problem. Specifically, the 177th Fighter Wing in my district experienced a CONUS COLA drop of 7% in 2017 compared to 2016. It was cutting paychecks this year. While the FY17 supplemental funds a 2.1% pay raise for troops is authorized in the 17 NDAA, and by law, DOD must provide this pay raise. Unless the supplemental is passed, DOD will likely have to realign funds from military personnel accounts. So, first for General Goldfein, what is the effect on service members' pay in FY17 if FY17 supplemental is not passed, exacerbating the strains they have already experienced with such a CONUS COLA cuts? How could this affect service members' morale, recruitment, and retention? I know it's not good, but I'd like to hear it in your words. And what other personnel issues concern you if we're stuck in a year-long CR?
No, thanks, sir. I'll piggyback on what General Neller said. When it comes to meeting our obligations to our airmen, when it comes to pay, we're going to meet those obligations. The issue is we're going to have to go somewhere in that military personnel account to find that money. So it's the trade-offs that will be the issue. For example, under a continuing resolution, we've talked about PCS moves, right? Moves, change of station. For the Air Force, for 5 months of a CR, there will be 13,000 families that now will have to be delayed in their moves. of those families that now that have children in school, think of all of the issues that will go on now to have to delay all of those moves into the fall cycle after they've started school. That puts a stress on our families that actually can't be quantified. When it comes to your last part of your question, which is what are my biggest concerns relative to a long CR, quite frankly, it's breaking faith with our airmen and their families. They've been at this for 26 years now. They will stay with us if they believe they can count on us to ensure that we take care of them and their families as they deploy. They will stay with us if they believe they are given the resources to be the very best they can be. And so I go back to my point. Pilots who don't fly, maintainers who don't maintain, air traffic controllers who don't control will not stay with us. So that's why you're hearing all of us talk about readiness as our top priority. And being able to fund them to be able to get them in the air is a key priority for the United States Air Force.
We only have a little more than a minute, but General Milley, you want to comment on that as well?
Thanks, Congressman. Just very briefly, I concur and endorse everything that Finger said, General Goldfein said. By law, we're supposed to do a 2.4% pay raise. ECI is how they calculate it, to keep pace with inflation. 2.1% is built into it. If we go to a CR or go to BCA funding, that's going to kill any pay raise. Right now, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, we're reasonably well paid by global standards. But I want you to consider something, that in World War II, only 10% of the United States military was married. Today, 60% of us are married. And on average, there's 2 children. So you're talking about families of 4 here. So an E5 or an E4, a sergeant or a specialist or corporal, with a family of 4, earns just slightly above the poverty level. There are thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines today that still use food stamps. That should really get people's attention. And if we don't pass the CR, or if we don't pass the budget with the supplemental, it's going to hurt their pay, it's going to hurt other forms of benefits, it's going to hurt services, and it's going to crush morale. It'll be very devastating to morale. Again, I can't highlight enough yellow ink here to get the budget and the supplemental passed, because to do otherwise is going to have significant negative impact.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. We have 5 legislative days, not counting today, to get this done. So obviously the urgency of your message is, very important, and again, we appreciate it. Admiral Richardson, I want to just drill down a little bit on the maintenance availability's impact of a CR, but before I do, I would just like to clarify a point that was raised yesterday when General Hyten of Strategic Command testified over in the Senate regarding the knife-edge timeline the Navy faces to sustain the SSBN fleet. As he correctly stated, Ohio SSBNs will be coming offline starting in 2027 at a rate of 1 per year, which you've testified about many times. In order to avoid dipping below 10 SSBNs while the new Columbia class comes into service, last December CR, we included a year-long $773 million anomaly to keep Columbia moving forward with detailed design and production this year. Just again, for clarification's sake, is that $773 million plus up that we, again, made as a year-long anomaly adequate to keep Columbia on track this year?
Sir, I appreciate you highlighting the forced march that we are on to get that submarine on patrol in 2031. And this is a program with 0 margin. And so we need every dollar of that for the year to keep that on track. There's good news there. The team up at Electric Boat has regained track, so our designs are on pace. But I'll tell you, there's no margin in that. And even the fact that you highlighted going down to 10, that requires, pretty much error-free operation to maintain requirements at that. So that'll be adequate for this year, but
right.
Stable, continuous funding to keep that on track.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Admiral Milley, when he was over here earlier this year, stated that a year-long CR would drive the Navy to cancel some 14 or more ship availabilities. You're dealing with a phenomenon over the last couple of years of carrier gaps. Obviously, that would kind of spread into other areas of the fleet in terms of performance gaps. And I was wondering, again, if you could just kind of highlight that, that little
yes, sir.
critical point.
I mean, certainly we don't just fix the ships just to fix them. We We maintain and upgrade those ships so they can go forward and do the nation's business. And so, but we need to send them forward fully ready, maintained, ready to go, just like your car would be. You just wouldn't drive your car without doing the maintenance on it, without giving it the gas. And so this will translate downstream. The maintenance thing writ large, you know, when you can't fly an air wing because of the aircraft aren't maintained, that just will result in, you know, we're not going to send them forward untrained. We're not going to send them forward unable to defend themselves because of poor maintenance. And so this will result in a smaller Navy around the world, longer tethers, less presence, gaps, if you will. And so it's, you know, it's a domino effect. As well, when those maintenance availabilities get canceled, well, all of our, particularly the private shipyards, have to adapt to that as well. And so their workforce is going to have to be cut. And those people necessarily do not come back. They'll find new jobs. And so it just, you can see this downward spiral that results.
And just to follow up the chairman's question about what's different this time, again, Admiral Milley seemed to suggest that, you know, this is going to happen pretty much immediately if the CR is the final outcome.
Sir, our fleet commanders and maintainers are hanging on with their fingernails right now. They wanted to take action before because they're at risk. Right? There's laws in place here in terms of spending more money than you have. And if we don't pass this, this will come to, it will be abrupt. They've extended this as long as they can.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, thank you for your incredible answer to Susan Davis concerning the prospects of continuing CRs. Your statement that it's malpractice and unprofessional is incredibly important, and everyone in Congress needs to hear it. We know certainly that members of this committee not only understand it, but are the advocates to the rest of Congress to try to ensure that it doesn't happen. When the last CR came forward, many of you are aware that our members of this committee refused to vote for the CR unless we received a promise from the Speaker that DoD appropes would move from the House. It did. There is no reason, as we look forward to the prospects of a CR, that DoD funding should be an exception. There's no reason it should not be an exception. We've already passed DoD appropes. We've already passed the NDAA. They should absolutely just be stapled to whatever's moving forward for funding, and we certainly are going to be advocating that it does. But I want to drill down for a minute on what the effects of sequestration and a possible CR, General Milley, would be, specifically on the Army. Last year, Chris Gibson and I introduced the Posture Act. The bill recognized the importance of ground forces in current and future conflicts, and most importantly, implemented a strategic pause in the Obama administration's proposed reductions to land force in strength levels given future and current threats. It began the process of reversing the harmful effects of downsizing our land forces as a result of the Budget Control Act. Under Chairman Thornberry's leadership, we successfully incorporated these in-strength increases as part of the NDAA for fiscal year 2017. The NDAA provided full funding for manning, training, and equipping for these increases. These in-strength authorizations associated with the fiscal year 17 NDAA will allow the Army to begin the process of mitigating some of the strategic risks imposed by the Budget Control Act. However, we recently heard testimony from the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and he stated that at today's in-strength, the Army risks consuming readiness as fast as we build it. This leads me to believe that we need to continue to look at ways to reasonably continue to grow the Army, to minimize the risks associated with current and future operational demands. So, a few questions in that regard. First, we now know that the President has proposed a spending level of 603 for fiscal year 18. As you know, our Chairman has proposed 640. Could you please tell me what the effects of a 603 funding level in the aggregate would be on rebuilding our military, and what is the impact on Army in-strength under a year-long CR? As we've continued to try to rebuild, what would the effect of the CR be? So those two questions.
There'll be lots of impacts. Probably the most significant, we've been authorized and moved out for the regular Army to reverse the downward trend in end strength and to move out to 476 by 1 October of this year. For the National Guard, we want to stabilize that force and bring them to 343,000 by 1 October. And for the U.S. Army Reserve, we'd like to bring them back to about 197 or 197,000 by 1 October. Year-long CR will stop all of that. It'll stop the recruiting. As I mentioned earlier, it'll stop the basic training, and we will essentially resume a downward trend. What does that mean? Operationally, it means that units are going to go to the field at less than optimal strength for training. We already have units in the field for training in the 60 to 70 percentile versus what is required of 90 to 95% present for training. That's a significant degradation in capability over time. We're going to end up having to, if it's a year-long CR, we'll end up having to cancel the National Training Center rotations out in California, and we'll end up canceling JRTC rotations. We will also end up canceling significant collective training for home station training for all of the active units. And for the Guard, they're going to have to cancel 4 of their what we call XCTCs, or significant training events. So training across the board, beginning shortly after we run out of money in May, looking at June or July, training will be reduced to individual squad training. Individuals and squads an Army does not make. You have to train at the company, the battalion, the brigade, and higher levels in order to have an effective force for full spectrum warfare against the type of enemies that are possible out there. So it will be very significant across the board, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garamendi.
Gentlemen, thank you for your impassioned plea for money. You know where it's coming from. It's coming from all the other things that the American public would like us to do, and frankly, we need to do. Our ranking member spoke to the 30% decrease in the State Department and what that means. The $5 billion decrease in the National Institute of Health research programs for everything from cancer to Alzheimer's and the like. So we're going to make some choices here. You've been told to develop a war plan for ISIS. Where is that plan? General Milley, where is the plan for the war? Where's the war plan for ISIS? You're supposed to have it done in 30 days.
Yeah, Congressman, appreciate that. I'm not going to discuss classified operational matters.
Well, just
in
tell me,
session,
General,
but I'll be happy to do that.
Where is the plan? Not what it is. Where is it?
It's been submitted, and it's been looked at and reviewed, and it's been submitted.
This committee?
I don't know that we submit it to this committee.
No, I don't
We
believe
submit
you
it through the
have.
chain of command, through the chairman,
You
up
have
through
$5
the
billion
Secretary of Defense.
in your
Excuse me?
supplemental. You have $5 billion for a war plan that's never been submitted to us. You expect us to approve something that you've not submitted to us?
Congressman, I'm not going to get into a discussion of
No, just my
classified
question
operational
was very
plan.
direct, sir.
I'm sorry?
Do you expect us to give you $5 billion in a war plan that you've not submitted to us?
I would ask that you refer that to the Secretary of Defense or the President. We work through the chain of command on war plans.
That's not an answer to my question, but I guess the answer is that you would expect us to approve a plan that's not been submitted. Where the money would be spent, how it would be spent, where it would be spent. Okay, fair enough. That's $5 billion of the $30 billion supplemental. You said in this testimony that pay will be reduced unless you have the supplemental, but yet in the base bill there's a 2.1% pay increase. How does that work? General Goldfein, apparently you'd like to answer.
Yes, sir. And what we said was that we will find the money within our budget to pay that 2% pay raise. The issue is we'll have to make choices and trades within the military personnel account to do that.
And I
So
think
we
the
will.
budget, if I might, sir, the budget that we put out, the 2017 appropriation, had 2.1% built into it for the forces that presumably you have, all of you have. Are you suggesting that that is not the way we...
No, sir, we're not suggesting that at all. The appropriations that came from this body had a growth, for example, of 3,000 Marines and a 2.1% pay. What we were brought here today to talk about would be the impact if we had the continuing resolution went through the whole year.
And you spent a good deal of your time talking about the supplemental. All four of you did.
No, I believe we spent most of our time talking about the effect of the CR, but I take your point.
And we're debating the word good time, good deal of your time. Let's not get into too much detail about how much time you spent on the supplemental, but each one of you advocated for the supplemental, and at least I've never seen how you would want that supplemental to be spent in certain key areas. That's not to say it may not be necessary, but we are going to have to make some tough choices, and we're going to need some detail in order to make those choices. General Goldfein, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about, do we really need to replace all of our ground-based strategic missiles in the near term? You know, that is about $50 billion. Do we need to do it right now? Or can that be delayed and we can do some of these other things that you'd like to have us do?
Sir, I would submit to you that that all three legs of the triad, the missile leg, the bomber leg, and the submarine leg, the three legs of the triad, were all built to build into a specific attribute we were looking for. The missile leg gives us the most responsive leg of the triad. The bomber leg gives us the most flexible leg, and the submarine is the most survivable leg of the triad. And my best military advice to you, sir, is that we need all three of those legs to be able to do the mission that we have been asked to do.
I've got 10 seconds. I'm not debating whether we need it or not. My question is, when do we need it? When do we need, we have to make some tough choices.
Absolutely.
And in making those tough choices, some things may get delayed. We've got to figure out what needs to be delayed. With that, I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just try to clarify one thing here. I don't think there's anything in any legislation where a plan has to be devised and given to this committee. I think your responsibility is to the Secretary of Defense. His responsibility is to the President. And at some point, we are interested in what that plan is, but I don't think that's written in stone that we have to be given that plan at point X. Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. General Milley, I do want to ask you about a readiness and modernization issue. Currently, Fort Carson, which is in my district, has a brigade combat team deployed to Europe in support of our allies to deter Russian aggression. To get the BCT ready to deploy, they obviously require reliable, modern equipment and training. So my two-part question is, if we had a CR, will the next brigade combat team out of Fort Carson be able to deploy with reliable equipment and necessary training? And secondly, would the next Stryker brigade out of Fort Carson be able to go to the National Training Center to get critical training before deploying?
Congressman, the Stryker brigade you're referring to, that's one of the rotations that would be canceled. So if there's a year-long CR, that unit rotation would likely be canceled. For the deployment to Europe, we plan on fully funding and resourcing units that are deploying into Iraq, Afghanistan, and other areas of combat. However, the unit that goes to Europe, for example, on a rotational base that you're referring to, they would not get their full suite of home station training prior to deploying. Because of the personnel strength issue that was previously discussed, the end strength issue, they would likely not deploy at full operational readiness standards that we would like them to deploy at. So there would be a negative impact on that particular brigade deploying.
Thank you. That's very sobering and to me has national implications and certainly has community implications back in Colorado Springs. General Goldfein, I'd like to ask you a question about space. In your written statement, you say that the JICSPOC recently renamed the National Space Defense Center will face critical acquisition delays. You also mentioned delays in the new GPS ground infrastructure and GPS 3. So my question is this: with so many military and civilian systems reliant on assured access to space, and even just GPS is critical for navigation, for financial transactions. 2 billion out of our 7 billion people use GPS every day, one way or another, on the surface of the Earth. What does this mean for security in space and access to our space-based resources?
Yes, sir. You know, we've been the stewards of space since 1954, and we continue to take that priority seriously. As we look at the GPS constellation, moving forward with GPS 3, with the ground-based stations, and with all of the integration that needs to occur is a priority. And so we're managing that very closely. The part that we actually haven't discussed here, I think General Milley may have referred to it earlier, and that's the impact on the industrial base if we don't have a resolution. This is an incredibly sophisticated workforce that you keep on the books if you're industry to be able to do the business of space. And so as we jockey the throttle between a CR, a budget, no budget, an annual appropriation or not, these industries that we rely on to be able to bring that kind of sophisticated workforce have got to figure out what they do with them when we tell them, well, we're not going to be able to use the workforce for next year, but we're hoping we can do the year after that. So it has incredible impact on the industrial base for CEOs out there who are trying to manage their businesses. And I will tell you, as the service that's working the preponderance of space, that's a significant impact.
Okay, I want to thank you all for your service, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and thank you for your service. A special shout-out, of course, to Admiral Richardson for the time you spent in Pearl and on the USS Honolulu. Thank you very much. I represent the congressional district that is home to PACOM, and we all know PACOM is the largest AOR among all of you. You all know that. And, of course, the concerns, like this morning with North Korea in protest maybe of what's going on in Mar-a-Lago. They shot off missiles, and we also saw this morning's news as to what's going on in Syria. Having said all of that, we understand, and I in particular are very empathetic to the fact that you are on a CR. But the fact remains, I think Admiral Richardson, you in particular pointed out in your written statement that we are 6 months into the CR. And irrespective of what happens between now and 5 days from now, chances are it may not be anything that you want to see. The House, I think, has done, as the chairman says, its job. It's sent over basically the defense budget, or defense approach. But having done that, we are in a situation where you will be potentially faced with it, and historically you have been faced with it. And General, I agree with you. It may border on malpractice if we were in a civilian situation, but the fact remains that is what happens. Yesterday, where Admiral Richardson sits, we had Undersecretary Flournoy, and former Undersecretary made a statement that one of the things that she thought was necessary was a flexibility in your individual abilities, the defense's abilities to move funds. So my question to each and every one of you is, we can all agree, we don't like it, we don't like the situation you're in, but the fact is you are in that situation. I'd like to understand what you all do to make things work. I mean, I'm envisioning someone in the back room with a little pencil saying, it's another month, Admiral, or another month, General, so we're going to have to move money here and there if we're going to do X. I assume you have the ability to do that. And if you don't have the ability to do that, I'd like to know what will make it better so that you can compensate for that. And like I said, we all concede. CR is not good, but we're 6 months into it, and even if you were to get what you want, you still have 6 months that you had to have done something and made it work. So with that, whoever wants to take the stab.
Ma'am, I'll lead off. The first part of the deal was that everything that we've requested, particularly in the supplemental, would be executable in the remaining time. So it's, the 6-month period of time is that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have been doing all of that adjustments that revisit and revisit to a tremendous waste of time and energy by our leadership as we navigate through the shoal waters of just continuing budget unpredictability, instability, and insufficient levels. But we're out, for this year, we are out of creative space. Our fleet commanders, Admiral Swift out there in Pearl Harbor as well, who runs the fleet for Admiral Harris at PACOM, he and his colleague, Admiral Davidson in Norfolk, they are out of options. They have stretched it to the breaking point on the faith that we will be able to do something to be able to fund the rest of the year. And so I share that faith that they have. This is not a fait accompli. We can do the right thing. Get your military out so it can defend the nation, can provide the flexibility and protection for all of the other things to happen. I'm just not ready to concede that this is the new normal.
Ma'am, if I could add that, so here's the sandbox for a service chief: capability, capacity, readiness. And we make strategic trades. And so I mentioned earlier that prior to 2014, the world was different. And so as we were making trades, I can tell you in the Air Force, we actually traded capacity and readiness to get capability, to modernize for the future. Then the world changed. And so we have to relook at that balance and make different kinds of trades. When we're then limited or restricted congressionally or legislatively to be able to work within that box, to be able to make those trades, it makes our job even harder, because what we owe you is the best Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine Corps that we can give you for the money that we're given. And so that's what happens. I'll give you one quick example. So we got additional acquisition authorities. We've used those acquisition authorities to be able to look at weapons system that we can procure at a faster rate. We get in a CR, anything that falls in the New Start category, we're going to be stopped. So modernization is future readiness. And so that's one example of when we get legislative restrictions of our ability to move within that sandbox, it's hurtful.
Mr. Chair, I'm out of time. Could we ask that it be submitted for the record? Thank you.
If the other witnesses have other comments, absolutely. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your leadership. I think it's unfortunate we find ourselves in a situation where we hear this familiar refrain, and that is the uncertainty of resources coming forward, and what you all have done to accommodate that leaves you at a place where you have no flexibility to do the job that we ask you to do. Whether it's the O plans, whether it's a national defense strategy, we're now stretched to the limit. We are there at this point. I think that begs the question, what's the collective impact of this line of CRs of the sequester? I've talked earlier about time is now one of our adversaries, because we lose time with these things. When we have a CR and the things that we can't do, and we redirect dollars, as you should, to training, to developing readiness, but that takes away money from programs where we're trying to modernize, we're trying to keep up with our adversaries. And then there are additional costs. So when you try to catch up later, you never catch up time-wise, and it's more expensive to do that later. Admiral Richardson, give me your perspective on the impacts of this roller coaster ride of uncertainty and where it leaves you in whether it's postponed ship availabilities, whether it's lack of training for pilots. Where does that leave you, and what's the overall long-term impact both of time that we lose and of additional cost to regenerate that in the future?
Yes, sir. Sir, if I could, how about if I phrase my answer in the positive and talk about what could be done if we pass this budget with its supplemental. And I'll run down as quickly as I can a fairly extensive list. First, we'll keep the USS Ponce forward deployed on station in the Middle East. We'll retain 5 cruisers deployable. We'll buy repair parts, ship spares, consumables. We'll fill those coffers. We'll fund the 14 availabilities for submarines and surface ships that were talked about earlier. We'll fund 14,000 flying hours for tactical squadrons, and we'll fund 27,000 flying hours for student pilots. Our aviation spares, which have been a big contributor to the reduced readiness of aviation, will be funded. We'll upgrade our afloat and ashore networks to improve their cybersecurity. We'll add 15,000 moves and increase the lead time for those moves to 2 months or more, from 2 months to 4 months. We'll do material improvements to 6 airfields, 5 piers, 3 hangars, a communication center, and other facilities. We'll do security improvements, physical security improvements to our bases. We'll buy more Tomahawk missiles, more rolling airframe missiles, more ship-to-shore connectors. We'll complete the FY16 DDG. We'll keep on track the aircraft carrier CVN-80. We'll keep on track 2 aircraft carrier overhauls. We'll keep on track LHA-8, the TAOX program. We'll complete a destroyer, and 4 LCSs, LPD, and other expeditionary ships. The list goes on and on. This is what we can do if we pass that budget with its supplemental. What a list that is. And this is just the Navy, the Joint Force. Each of my comrades here, my colleagues, has a list just like that. And so you flip that coin on its other side, and all of those things will not get done. And that divot will be felt for decades in the United States Navy.
Very good.
Let me make
General Milley,
a brief comment. You know, for 2.5 centuries, our country has got a long, cyclic history of unreadiness for the next conflict. When they fired the first shot at Lexington, they had no idea they were entering into an 8 or 9 year war with the greatest power of the day. We weren't ready for the Civil War. Lincoln thought he was going into a 90-day conflict to put down a local rebellion. We sent guys off with wool uniforms to Cuba and to the tropics. World War I, which we're in the 100th anniversary of World War I right now, that army was fighting Pancho Villa on the Mexican border 2 years after that war started, and we enter into it in 1917. Pershing takes those soldiers over there. They're in a state of unreadiness when they get there, and he has to train them for 6 or 8 months in France before he commits them to ground combat. World War II is well known. Right after Pearl Harbor in 1942, go look at the history of 1942. Look at Guadalcanal, Tarawa. Look at the naval battles in the South Pacific. My father fought in the Central Pacific. 1942 was a disaster for the United States military in the Pacific, and it was a disaster in North Africa at Kasserine Pass. Look at June 1950, Korea, yet again, where we were completely in a state of unreadiness, where Task Force Smith deploys with 2 squads out of a platoon, 2 platoons out of a company, maintenance and equipment that didn't work, soldiers that weren't adequately trained. The ultimate impact of all of this stuff is cumulative, and it results in failed battles, lost battles, and dead soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on a battlefield. That's what this ultimately results in.
Thank you, General Milley. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.